The lawyer's voice droned on in my father's dining room, reading words I'd waited months to hear. My mother had passed away 8 months earlier, and her will was finally being settled. I sat across from my father and my younger brother, hands folded in my lap. Then the lawyer said something that made my heart stop. Everything, the savings account, the small investment portfolio my mother had built, the life insurance payout, was going to my brother. My father nodded slowly, like he'd expected this reaction from me. He looked directly at me and said the word that would haunt me for weeks. "It's fair." Everyone around the table, my aunt, my uncle, even the lawyer, turned to look at me. They were waiting for tears, anger, something. Instead, I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. My brother smiled. Not a small smile. A satisfied one. I opened my mouth to speak, but my father raised his hand. He kept talking, explaining his reasoning like I was a child who needed simple words. He said my brother needed help getting established. He said I had a good job and no debts. He said I'd always been fine on my own. My aunt nodded along. My uncle looked down at his plate. No one interrupted. No one said, "Wait, that doesn't seem right." The humiliation was surgical and public. My father had orchestrated this moment carefully. When he finally stopped talking, my brother leaned forward and thanked him. He actually said the words, "Thanks for doing the right thing, Dad." My throat tightened. My hands stayed folded. I realized then that this wasn't a surprise to anyone but me. I excused myself 20 minutes later. My voice was steady when I said I had work in the morning. My father barely looked up. Outside, the autumn air bit at my face, and I stood beside my car for a long moment. This wasn't about money. It was about being erased. About being so reliable that I became invisible. The word fair kept echoing in my head like a cruel joke. I'd spent years being the daughter who called every week, who helped my mother with doctor's appointments, who never asked for anything. And now I understood what that had earned me. My father didn't follow me outside. Not then. Not ever during those weeks. That told me everything. I drove home in silence, and memories surfaced like stones rising in water. My brother's business that failed 3 years ago. I'd loaned him money he never repaid. The time he lost his apartment and stayed with me for 5 months. The job references I'd provided. The late night calls I'd answered. I'd fix things quietly, never making him feel small. That was the pattern. He stumbled. I caught him. My father praised him for trying. Meanwhile, I built a career, bought my own home, managed my life with steady hands. I never made noise. Never needed saving. And somehow, that had become my crime. I decided something that night. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't beg. I would watch. The family group chat lit up the next morning. Relatives I barely heard from were praising my father's wisdom. Someone posted that it was generous to help the child who needed it most. Another aunt wrote that I was lucky to be so independent. I read every message. I typed nothing. My brother posted a photo of himself at a car dealership that afternoon. The caption read, "New chapter." 43 people liked it. I stared at that photo for a long time. He looked triumphant. He looked like someone who'd won something he deserved. I still didn't respond. But I saved that screenshot. I wasn't sure why yet, but instinct told me to keep a record. I spent that evening reviewing documents I'd kept from my mother's financial planning. She'd worked hard for 30 years as a school administrator. She'd been deliberate about saving. The inheritance wasn't massive, but it was significant, around $80,000 plus investments. What my father gave my brother wasn't just money. It came with responsibility. There were accounts to manage, tax obligations, investment decisions. My mother had always handled those things herself. My brother had never balanced a budget in his life. I noticed something else in the paperwork. Some of the accounts required active management. There were deadlines, responsibilities no one had explained to him. I realized then what I'd been given wasn't nothing. It was freedom. 2 weeks later, my brother called. His voice had a tone I didn't recognize at first, uncertain, almost nervous. He asked if I had a minute to talk about some financial stuff. He'd never asked me about finances before. Never needed to. I kept my voice neutral and asked what was wrong. He laughed awkwardly and said nothing was wrong. He just wanted advice on managing investments. There was a pause. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Dad said you'd help." Those 4 words told me everything. My father had assumed I'd step in. He'd factored my compliance into his plan. I felt that cold clarity return. My brother kept talking, asking about tax forms and account types. I listened. Then I spoke. I told him gently that I didn't think it was appropriate for me to help. I explained that he'd received the inheritance and the responsibility that came with it. I suggested he hire a financial advisor. My tone wasn't angry. It wasn't petty. It was simply firm. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long. Then my brother laughed, but it sounded forced. He said he was just asking a simple question. I repeated my suggestion about hiring a professional. He laughed again, too quickly this time, too loudly, and said sure. No problem, he'd figure it out. We said goodbye. I sat holding the phone for a while afterward. That conversation had shifted something. He'd expected me to say yes. And I'd surprised him. 3 weeks after the will reading, there was a family dinner at my father's house. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to see something. My brother arrived late, looking tired. Everyone congratulated him again, calling him responsible, saying he'd used the money wisely. He smiled and accepted the praise. But I watched his face. There was strain behind the smile. After dinner, I went to get my coat and overheard my brother and my father talking in the study. My brother's voice was tight. He was asking about paperwork, about deadlines he'd missed. My father sounded frustrated. He said something about getting it together and this is what you wanted. I left quietly, but I'd seen something new in my father's expression. Doubt. I made an appointment with a financial advisor the following week. Not because I needed help. I'd always managed my own money carefully. I wanted to understand what my brother was actually dealing with. The advisor reviewed the documents I'd brought and explained the accounts, the tax implications, the required reporting. She asked if I'd received any of this inheritance. When I said no, she raised her eyebrows. She said managing this kind of estate wasn't complicated, but it required attention and follow-through. Missing deadlines could mean penalties. Mismanaging investments could mean losses. She looked at me carefully and said, "Sometimes being left out is the better outcome." I smiled for the first time in weeks. I'd escaped something heavy, and I hadn't even known it. My brother missed a filing deadline in November. I only knew because my father called me, sounding strained. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how I was. He just said my brother had made a mistake with some tax paperwork and there was a penalty. He sighed heavily and said he'd hoped this would teach my brother responsibility. I stayed quiet. My father asked if I'd heard him. I said yes. He waited for me to offer to fix it. I didn't. After an uncomfortable pause, he said he had to go. The inheritance was starting to cost my brother. Not just money. Time. Stress. Peace. And no one had warned him. Or maybe they had, and he hadn't listened. In December, I accepted a promotion at work. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid, a leadership role I'd worked toward for 2 years. I posted a simple announcement on social media. The responses surprised me. Former colleagues congratulated me. Friends from college reached out. People noticed. So did my father. He sent a brief text. "Saw your news. Congratulations." It was the first time he'd reached out since the will reading. 3 days later, he called and asked if we could meet for coffee. His voice was different. Softer. Almost uncertain. I agreed to meet him the following Tuesday. When I hung up, I felt something shift. He was starting to see me again. But only because I'd stopped waiting for him to. We met at a cafe near his house. My father ordered coffee and spent the first 10 minutes talking about weather and work. Then he finally said what he'd come to say. He'd assumed I'd be fine with the inheritance decision. He thought I'd understand. He still used that word, fair. But this time, his voice wavered slightly. He said he'd thought my brother needed it more. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked him one question. Do you still think it was fair? He looked at his coffee cup. He didn't answer. I finished my drink, thanked him for meeting me, and left. When I glanced back through the cafe window, he was still sitting there, staring at nothing. He looked smaller than I remembered. The family pressure started quietly in January. First, it was my aunt calling to say that family was important. Then my uncle mentioned that helping each other was what we did. No one said my brother's name directly, but everyone meant him. They wanted me to step in, to fix whatever was breaking. They framed it as keeping harmony. I refused each time. Kindly, firmly. I explained that my brother had received everything and I respected his independence. The word independence made people uncomfortable. It reminded them that I'd been cut out. Whispers started. I heard them secondhand, people saying I was holding a grudge, that I was being difficult. Let them whisper. I knew the truth. My brother finally confronted me in February. He called late on a Thursday night, and his voice was sharp. He accused me of abandoning him when he needed help. He said I was being selfish and petty. I let him finish. Then I reminded him calmly that he had everything. The money, the investments, the family's full support. I had none of that. If he couldn't manage what he'd been given, that wasn't my fault. He shouted that I was his sister. I said quietly, "And you're my brother." The line went silent. Neither of us said what we were really thinking. That fairness only mattered to him now that he was struggling. He hung up first. I didn't call back. In March, there was a community fundraiser my family attended every year. My brother came, looking polished but exhausted. He talked too much, laughed too loud. At one point, he was telling someone about managing investments and contradicted something he'd said 5 minutes earlier. I wasn't the only one who noticed. An older family friend approached me later by the refreshment table. She asked quietly how I was doing. I said I was fine. She nodded slowly, then said something that surprised me. "Your brother seems overwhelmed." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Other people were starting to see what I'd known all along. He wasn't built for this, and my father had set him up to fail. By April, the responsibilities were visibly weighing on my brother. He'd aged in 6 months. There were lines around his eyes. He snapped at people. He stopped posting on social media. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious. I just stayed focused on my own life. My work was going well. I'd started taking art classes on weekends. I was building something quiet and good. Meanwhile, my father started calling more often. Short calls, checking in, asking vague questions about how I was managing things. I knew what he was really asking. He wanted to know if I was still angry, if I'd help if he asked. I kept my answers brief and kind. I didn't give him what he wanted. In May, my father hinted at regret for the first time. We were on the phone, and he mentioned how stressful things had been. He said he wished the situation had been easier. He didn't say he'd been wrong. He didn't apologize. But he asked me to step in just this once to help my brother with a complicated financial form. He framed it as a small favor, a family kindness. I felt the old pull, the instinct to fix, to smooth, to rescue. Then I remembered sitting at that dining table, hearing the word fair. I told my father, gently, that my brother needed to handle his own responsibilities. There was a long pause. Then my father said quietly, "I understand," and hung up. But I knew he didn't. Not yet. I learned the full truth in June. A cousin who worked in estate law mentioned casually that inheritances like my brother's often included hidden complications. I asked what she meant. She explained that my mother's estate had some old debts attached, nothing major, but they required careful management. There were also reputational responsibilities tied to some of the investments. My brother had accepted everything without reading the details. He hadn't understood what he was taking on. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that I'd been spared. Sadness that my brother had been so eager to win that he hadn't asked questions. And clarity. Everything was beginning to unravel. And it was happening exactly as it had to. In July, my brother made a public mistake. He posted something on social media complaining about ungrateful family members. He didn't name me, but everyone knew. The post was bitter and raw. People responded with confusion. Some asked what happened. Others stayed silent. My father called me that night, his voice tight. He asked if I'd seen the post. I said yes. He asked if I was going to respond. I said no. He sighed heavily and said this was getting out of hand. I stayed quiet. Then he said something that stunned me. Maybe I should have thought this through differently. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he'd come. I told him I had to go. He sounded afraid when he said goodbye. In August, my father asked me a direct question. We were sitting in his backyard, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him. He asked if I thought he'd been wrong. Not about the inheritance. About calling it fair. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I repeated his word back to him. Fair. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. He flinched like I'd struck him. His face crumpled slightly, and he looked away. We sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then I stood, told him I needed to leave, and walked to my car. He didn't follow me. When I looked back, he was still sitting there, staring at his hands. The word had finally landed. By September, things fell apart quickly. One of my mother's investment accounts lost value because my brother hadn't rebalanced it. A tax penalty came through that could have been avoided. My brother's frustration boiled over at a family gathering. He shouted that no one had prepared him for this, that he'd been set up to fail. People looked uncomfortable. My father tried to calm him down, but my brother turned on him. He said bitterly, "You told me I deserved this." The room went silent. My father had no answer. Later, my brother sent me a text. It was short, "I need help." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone down. I didn't respond. In October, I set a boundary publicly. My brother asked me in front of the family to help him sort through financial documents. Everyone watched. This was the moment they expected me to give in, to be the dutiful daughter and sister. I looked at my brother and said calmly that I couldn't take on his responsibilities. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cruel. I was simply factual. I explained that he'd been given the resources and the control. If he needed help, there were professionals he could hire. People shifted uncomfortably, but no one argued. They understood. My brother's face went red, but he didn't push. My father stared at his plate. Later, my aunt told me quietly that I'd done the right thing. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. In November, my father finally said the words. We met for coffee again, and this time he didn't make small talk. He told me he'd made a mistake. He said fair had been a lazy excuse to avoid a harder conversation. He admitted he'd assumed I'd always be fine because I always had been. He said he'd lost something in the past year: authority, trust, peace of mind. He looked exhausted. He asked if I could forgive him. I didn't answer right away. I thought about that dining room, that lawyer's voice, that smile on my brother's face. Then I told him the truth. I said forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for like a favor. It was something I'd give myself when I was ready. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. That was new. By December, I'd built a life I was proud of. I didn't gloat. I didn't take anything back. I didn't need to. My brother eventually hired help and slowly stabilized, though the damage to his confidence and relationships remained. My father and I spoke occasionally, but the distance between us was permanent. He'd made a choice, and choices have consequences. The inheritance had broken the wrong person. It had revealed who could carry weight and who couldn't. I walked away from that year whole, respected, independent, and free. My father had wanted to teach my brother responsibility. Instead, he'd taught me my worth. And that, in the end, was what he regretted most. Not the money. The loss of me.